First up is the latest adaptation of The Color Purple. This is based on the musical, which is based on the 1985 film, which is, of course, based on the 1982 Pulitzer Prize-winning book. So an important piece of work that has been interpreted many times. The interesting thing about this is that I actually, I think a lot of us asked ourselves, like, do we need a new Color Purple? And, if you haven't seen the 1985 film, which I think is probably the most common interpretation up to this point, just because, sadly, not as many people read, but it's been a while since that came out, and this is technically a musical, so it is different, and I give it credit because a lot of my beef with movie musicals is, especially with like direct adaptations from stage, is that they don't take advantage of the medium of film. Like, you have sets, you have opportunities to do interesting camera work. You're not limited to a stage. And so I think this version of The Color Purple does a really good job of translating the musical experience into a cinematic form. So, kudos to them on that front. If you aren't familiar with the story of The Color Purple, it's a heavy one. It takes place in Georgia in the early 1900s, and it centers around two sisters, mostly about Celie, who is a girl who has just not been born into the best circumstances and is basically sold off to a man to marry. And it's about her journey and the women who come into her life along the way. Also, the men, unfortunately, and of course, race and gender issues. So there are some great and hilarious moments in this latest movie. So it's not the most Debbie Downer thing, but, this is some tough material to deal with. It stars Fantasia Barrino as Celie, as Taraji P. Henson as Suge Avery, Danielle Brooks as Sophia, Coleman Domingo as Mr., Corey Hawkins as Harpo, Halle Bailey as young Nettie, Sierra as older Nettie, her as Squeak, David Allen Greer as Rev Avery, Louis Gossett Jr. as old Mr., John Batiste is in it. It's a truly spectacular cast. Oprah Winfrey, Steven Spielberg, Quincy Jones, and Scott Sanders produced it. They were, of course, so integral to the original film version, so clearly it has the blessing of the previous film creatives. Also, Alice Walker, who's the original author, is an executive producer on it, so it is a very officially sanctioned production. I enjoyed the film. It is a little bit long for me. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes. I haven't actually seen the stage musical, so I can't compare it in terms of how, the songs are. And I do know they wrote a couple new songs for this in order to, be in awards contention. But overall, I still think they do a very good job. Like I said, a little bit long. Some of the themes are, of course, challenging. I think all the women in particular gave such spectacular performances. I know Coleman Domingo has been talked about for his performance in Rustin, but honestly, I feel like, and he plays, Mr. is a terrible character intentionally. He does such a good job in this. I'm surprised more people are not talking about his performance in this. I know Fantasia Barrino has the most to sort of work with in this movie because she is effectively the lead, but Danielle Brooks and Taraji P. Henson to a degree give these two there's just such magnificent moments in this that for them alone, it is worth going to see. I won't go too much more into the details of it. I do think it's worth watching. It's a full dramatic journey. The question of did we need to revisit this is debatable, but I do think, under the guise of it is a musical version of it, gives it enough meat that it is worth seeing both this, but I also recommend seeing the 1985 version and reading the book. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5. Next up is Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, and this is where the reviews start to go downhill from here. And I will also caveat, I know, this stuff came out basically around Christmas, and it's always a little weird with these release dates, so there's a good chance if you wanted to see this movie, you already saw it, and I hope you had a good time. If you were on the fence about it, and this is what's helping you determine, I'm just going to go ahead and just be upfront and say, no, I don't think this is worth your time or energy. I like Jason Momoa a ton. I like James Wan, who directed this, a ton. The character of Aquaman, whatever, I'm not, but I thought Jason Momoa was actually really excellent casting in it. This movie is such a hot mess. I saw the first one. I know I saw the first one factually. This movie, it feels like it's trying to be a Bobo Thor Ragnarok because you've got a whole family dynamic between Jason Momoa's Arthur / Aquaman. Patrick Wilson is back as Orm, who is his half brother, who, is basically the Loki of the movie. In fact, I'm sorry, tiny spoiler. They even reference Loki in this. And I'm like, come on, we're so on the head. I think Jason Momoa has been given a little more you can be sillier, kind of like Thor / Chris Hemsworth was allowed to do in Thor Ragnarok. It's just this, I like that he's bringing a more bubbly personality to it, but it doesn't fit with the rest of the movie. Also, I don't think I've seen a film that just does not trust its audience in a long time, maybe this entire year, doesn't trust its audience in the slightest. Almost everything is voiceover or narration, and it's just It's so inane and boring. And I can't tell if it was so bad it was good or if it was just so bad and I'm laughing out of a trauma response. This was brutal. It brings back a lot of folks from the first film. You've got Yahya Abdul-Mateen playing Black Manta again. You've got Amber Heard as Mira. Nicole Kidman is back as Atlanta, who is Jason Momoa and Patrick Wilson's mom. And I don't think she showed up for like 20 minutes into the movie. I just assumed they'd like killed off her character. And then it was like, boop, here she is. I went, okay. Tamora Morrison plays, Jason Momoa's father. Dolph Lundgren is back. It has Randall Park, who, congratulations, he is now in both comic cinematic universes. And get that paycheck, Randall. Get it, no, more power to you. Martin Short does a role in this. And I was like, is that... sorry, spoiler, he's a fish. I was like, is that fish Martin Short? He is. That is Martin Short. He is Kingfish. John Rhys Davies is also... I forgot. I guess John Rhys Davies was in the first one. I just didn't remember. He's like a shrimp. I just maybe I'm laughing. You know what? Maybe I did have a great time. I'm not sure. There are so many mushy themes happening in this. I say mushy in the sense of like conflated and like don't make any sense. There's this whole environmental plot line. There's this whole like Lord of the Rings ripoff plot line. Again, there's a Thor Ragnarok ripoff plot line. There's a whole thing about like family, which I guess is what Fast and the Furious, which Jason Momoa is also in. Good job, Jason. So basically, the other thing is, this is sort of the end of the DC cinematic universe as we know it. It's having seen this, I'm like, that's maybe not the worst thing in the world. It is 2 hours and 4 minutes. It was so painful to watch. It took so long. Mentally, it felt like 5 years of my life. It's really disjointed. The fun parts are not that fun. Like, I would almost just say, go to Jason Momoa's Instagram. It's much more fun than that. Yeah, no, just don't see this movie. I'm sorry. I could not find anything particularly redeeming about it. They introduced like a bunch of plot lines way too late. I'm sorry. There's also some stolen King Kong, Peter Jackson ripoff stuff. There's not many original things in this film. Yeah, it was rough. I'm sorry, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. I'm going to give it a 1.9 out of 5, and I feel like that's being pretty generous. The next film I have is Anyone But You, and I watched this right after I watched Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, and I didn't think I could see a film I liked less than that, and yet here we are with Anyone But You. It is a rom-com, and I'm putting that in air quotes, and it had Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell. It also has Alexandra Shipp and Michelle Hurd, Dermot Mulroney, Darren Barnett. It's a fine cast. Basically, a couple who maybe almost hooked up once and then decide to hate each other. I don't know. These two people, they meet randomly and then they end up at the same wedding in Australia together, but they hate each other's guts because it didn't work out that one time. And it's so, the premise is so stupid. Like they are so angry at each other over what is not even could be considered a one-night stand. Like, sorry if this is a spoiler, but they don't even like sleep together. And not that that's necessary to have a connection or anything like that, but they have one meet cute and then they hate each other because they overhear some things. And it's one of those movies that could just be solved with one conversation. They have zero romantic chemistry together. If you've seen the trailer for this movie, you've seen all the quote funny moments. Like that's it. I don't think there's anything else to this movie. It is an hour and 43 minutes and felt almost as painful to watch and like lengthwise as Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Even less redeeming things about it. It's trying really hard to emulate like the spontaneity and the joy of, I would say, like early 2000s rom-coms, and it has none of it. It just, nope. This was, my shoulders are inching up in stress thinking about having to relive this movie. Not a redeeming thing about this. The culprit of this film is dumb, toxic masculinity, generally speaking, which, is the culprit of many films, honestly, but it's not worth your time. It's not worth your time. I think the most interesting thing about this film, it gives Don't Worry Darling vibes in that the press tour and like the sort of gossip and rumors surrounding that, infinitely more interesting than the film itself. And that, the gossip around it, nowhere near close to the Don't Worry Darling drama. So that should tell you where this ranks. I am going to give this a 1.5 out of 5. And then just to round this painful, brutal week out, I didn't think it could get worse. I will say it's not quite as bad as Anyone But You, but I then watched Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, which is already too verbose of a title. This is the latest Zack Snyder film. It is out on Netflix, which is probably the only reason it is getting a slightly higher rating from me eventually than anyone but you, because I got to watch it at home. I don't even know how to describe it. It's a sci-fi movie, which I love. I love sci-fi movies. The guy tries to build, the guy being Zack Snyder, of course, tries to build a world, and, there's something about, like, rebels and an emperor and a coup, and who cares? It stars Sofia Boutella as this character called Cora, who is our protagonist, and she basically decides to rebel, and then episode 1 or whatever this is, part 1 is like getting the gang together. So she is assembling a crew. I don't think it's a spoiler. This is in the trailers. Ed Skrein plays a baddie who is dressed like a Nazi. Like, he just is a Nazi. Like, let's be honest, the character's a Nazi. And credit to Ed Skrein, who, I don't know how he is as a regular person, but he plays villain very well. He also just looks like a villain very well. The rest of the cast is rounded out by Jaimin Hansu, Michiel Huisman, Duna Bay, Ray Fisher, Charlie Hunnam, Stuart Martin, Stas Nair, Corey Stoll, and then Anthony Hopkins is a voice in it. And much like my reaction to Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, where I was like, is that Martin Short? I was like, is that Anthony Hopkins? You know what? Get those paychecks, gentlemen. Get those paychecks. I actually think there's a world in which this could have been an okay miniseries. But because it is cramming this all into 2 hours and 15 minutes of getting the gang together, and it's, again, much like Aquaman, like very expositional in terms of like, here, I'm going to package up for you the backstory of this character. And because there are so many people in the gang that they're getting together, it just, like, everyone gets 5 minutes basically, or like 10 minutes. And it's just not told in a very flowing way. It's sort of a jam down your throat, like, here's the information. Okay, moving on. Like, oh my God. It just, much like Aquaman, I'm sorry to keep comparing these things. Much like Aquaman, zero logic to it. It's just like, a hodgepodge Frankenstein together. Much like Anyone But You, there is absolutely no chemistry between anybody. Like, I feel like people weren't in the same scenes half the time. It's quite possible they weren't in the same scenes half the time. Shout out to Ed Skrein, honestly. Didn't think he would be the MVP of this. Also, Anthony Hopkins for just being Anthony Hopkins. But this was brutal. And then they announced that part 2 is already basically done and coming out in a couple, months. I was just like, I don't want to watch that. I don't think anyone else should want to watch that. It is just, yeah, I couldn't find much redeeming about it. I will say visually, it is beautiful. Conceptually, even there's like a world in which I could see elements of this working. It just certainly did not in this. I think Zack Snyder is one of those folks who, because he makes movies relatively like on a budget and is pretty good about it, and he has a vision. This is the other thing. I feel like it's a diluted version of a Zack Snyder film, and they're like a bunch of his films, I think like something like 300 or Sin City, you're like, oh yes, I know what you're doing here. And then with each film further and further, it just becomes like, okay, what are we doing here, dude? Like, what is your vision for this? And people have used the phrase derivative with this. I've been trying to avoid using it, but it feels like a watered down version of all these things. So I'm sorry. I know movies are hard to make. I know effort goes into it. I think everyone goes into it with their best intentions. I'm going to give this a 1.7 out of 5.